He stood in the cereal aisle like any other man, calm, quiet, deliberate. The lights above flickered soft and sterile, casting long reflections on polished tile. Somewhere nearby, a child laughed, a register beeped, a cart squeaked. Life went on. But in the eyes of a young officer across the store, he wasn't a man. He was a question, a risk, a target. A gun was drawn. Time stopped, and in that frozen breath, justice held its breath too, waiting to see if it would arrive as policy or tragedy. He didn't raise his voice. He raised his hands, and still the officer's finger twitched. But what he didn't know, what changed everything, was who that man really was. "Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now?" It was the kind of late afternoon that carried a hush over everything, the kind where the sun filtered softly through a bank of gray clouds, and even the air inside the grocery store felt like it had taken a deep breath. The automatic doors slid open with a tired sigh, as Theodore Brooks stepped inside, the quiet click of his old leather shoes, muffled against the polished linoleum floor. He walked without hurry, a tall man moving with the ease of someone who had nothing to prove, and nowhere urgent to be, his tan blazer buttoned neatly over a soft blue shirt, the sleeves creased with care. A gentle draft met him from the refrigerated produce section, brushing against his face like the past, cool, quiet, and familiar, in a way that made him feel at once present and far away. He reached for a basket instead of a cart, as he always did when he only had a few things on his wife's list. Milk bread, the brand of herbal tea she liked, and something sweet if the mood struck him. As he made his way past the end caps stacked with snacks and paper towels, he caught a faint tune playing from the store's speakers, something old, maybe Marvin Gaye, but distorted by the overhead system so much that it felt like memory rather than music. The store wasn't crowded, but it wasn't empty either. A mother corralled two kids by the frozen pizzas. A pair of teenagers in sports uniforms hovered near the candy. No one paid much attention to Theo, and that was how he liked it, just another man trying to get through the day. But not everyone saw him that way. The first sign of tension was so subtle he almost didn't notice it. The young police officer was leaning against a column near the floral department, arms crossed over his chest, radio clipped to his shoulder, eyes scanning the store like it was a war zone instead of a quiet place with bananas on sale. Theo had seen that stance before in rookies who hadn't yet learned the difference between vigilance and vanity. The officer's gaze landed on him, stuck there a little too long, then moved on. Theo kept walking. He had lived too many years to flinch at a glance, but something in his chest whispered caution. He moved past the breakfast aisle and stopped at the cereals. His wife liked the low-sugar kind with oats and almonds, but the store had rearranged everything since his last visit. He stood there a moment, squinting at the boxes, one hand on his hip, the other steadying the basket, and then a voice, sharp, abrupt, a command cutting through the silence like the crack of a starter's pistol. "Hey, you there! Stop right where you are!" Theo turned slowly. The officer had crossed the store and was now several feet away, hand resting on the grip of his holstered weapon, posture stiff with suspicion. The man's eyes were narrowed, lips tight, body wound up like a spring that didn't need much to uncoil. Theo raised an eyebrow, his tone calm but firm. "Is there a problem, officer?" The officer stepped closer, the clack of his boots echoing with a weight that made a nearby customer glance up from her cart. "You've been loitering near the same aisle for several minutes," he said, voice clipped. "Mind telling me what you're really doing here?" Theo felt a dozen things at once: confusion, disbelief, the first faint tendrils of anger curling beneath his ribs. He kept his voice even, measured. "I'm looking for cereal, that's all. I live in this neighborhood. My wife asked me to stop by." But the officer didn't move, didn't soften. His hand lingered at his hip. The tension wasn't diffusing, it was building, stacking itself higher with every second of silence. Theo took a breath and set the basket down gently on the floor, his hands open at his sides in the slow, deliberate way that experience had taught him was sometimes necessary. "I haven't done anything wrong," he said more quietly now. "I'd like to finish my shopping." The officer tilted his head like a dog trying to read a tone. "I don't think so," he said. "You're acting suspicious. Something about the way you're walking, looking around. You don't look like you belong here." Theo blinked. That last line sat heavy in the air, heavier than the rest. It was a familiar wound, reopened by the same blade it always was, assumption. The kind born from the illusion of authority and the poison of unchecked bias. He had trained officers for decades, good ones, ethical ones, and yet here he was standing in a cereal aisle being interrogated like a trespasser in his own town. There were choices he could make in that moment. He could show his old credentials, still tucked in the inside pocket of his blazer. He could say who he was, who he had trained, who he had lectured. But a deeper instinct, older, quieter, told him not to, not yet. Not while the man in front of him still saw a threat instead of a person. Instead, he straightened his back and met the officer's eyes, not with defiance, but with quiet, measured gravity. "I'm not required to answer questions without cause," he said, "and you haven't given me one." And in that brief pause where the lights above hummed and a toddler squealed somewhere near the bakery, something invisible broke. Not loudly, not with force, but with the cold certainty that this encounter had crossed an invisible line. One Theo had hoped he'd never cross again. And as the officer's hand tightened slightly on the gun still resting at his side, Theo knew with a heavy, weary clarity that this wasn't going to end with cereal. He hadn't always moved this slowly through a grocery store, but age like time wears down the need to rush, replacing urgency with patience and calculation. Every movement of Theodore Brooks's long frame carried a quiet intention, now the kind honed not by age alone, but by years of being watched, measured, questioned in places he had every right to be. His back was still straight, shoulders broad under the soft tan blazer, and though the silver in his hair had crept in steadily over the years, it had done nothing to dull the sharpness of his mind or the precision in his gaze. To someone passing by, he looked like a retired professor, or maybe a pastor dignified mild, someone who took his time reading cereal boxes because he truly cared what went into his body. But there was more behind his eyes than calm curiosity. Beneath the surface lay a slow-burning awareness, an ever-present readiness shaped by decades in federal law enforcement years that had taken him from training rooms in Quantico to police departments in crumbling cities and polished suburbs alike. He had taught men and women with shiny new badges how to handle their weapons, how to speak with authority without triggering fear, how to read a room without letting prejudice color what they saw. And yet, as he stood here now quietly observed by a young officer whose name he didn't know, he felt the weight of a bitter truth settle in again. The same truth he had taught others to recognize, but hoped would one day become obsolete. His fingers brushed the edge of a box on the shelf, not really reading it anymore, but giving himself something to do while he thought. The officer's presence behind him had gone from a footnote to a constant hum in his awareness, the way you feel the nearness of thunder, even before it breaks the sky. He knew the signs, the unnatural stillness, the watching eyes, the pulse of suspicion beating beneath the skin, and he felt it not just as a man who had trained others in situational awareness, but as a black man who had lived long enough to know when attention turns from observation to assumption. There was a time years ago when Theo believed his badge would shield him from moments like this. He remembered the pride of earning it, the crispness of the uniform he wore when he gave his first lecture on implicit bias to a room full of skeptical officers. He remembered the long nights spent reviewing use-of-force protocols, the arguments over what qualified as reasonable fear, and the weight of knowing that some minds, no matter how well you trained them, would always revert to fear when met with black skin and quiet confidence. And yet he stayed. Not because he thought he could fix everything, but because he had to believe that effort mattered, that planting seeds of understanding in even a handful of young officers could change the way some future man in his 70s would be treated when buying groceries. But now, standing in front of a shelf of oatmeal and raisins being stared at like a problem waiting to happen, Theo felt the heavy irony of that belief wrap around his chest like a vest too tight to breathe in. He let out a soft breath, barely audible, and adjusted the cuff of his blazer with one hand. His wedding ring caught the light, a small gleam of steadiness in the fluorescent haze. His wife had kissed him on the cheek before he left the house and said, "Don't forget the chamomile, not the mint. You always get the mint." And he had laughed, promising her he'd get it right this time. That was what he wanted to be thinking about: tea and dinner and the new book he had just started. But instead, he was measuring the body language of a young man in uniform, estimating distance, reading posture, scanning for escalation. The choice ahead of him wasn't unfamiliar, though it never got easier. Say nothing and allow the narrative to take shape in someone else's hands, or speak and risk becoming the problem he had been miscast as from the start. He turned slightly, not too fast, just enough to acknowledge the officer with a glance, not a challenge, not submission, just a look that said, "I see you, and I want you to see me clearly." Their eyes met for less than a second, but in that moment Theo saw it all. The stiffness in the jaw, the slight lift in the shoulders, the way the hand hovered just a little too close to the belt. He had trained that posture out of people before. He had warned about what came next when that posture wasn't interrupted. And he had also seen too many times what happened when it wasn't. "Can I help you with something?" Theo asked, his voice low, even free of sarcasm but edged with weary restraint. The officer didn't answer right away, just stared. That pause, brief as it was, told Theo more than words ever could. So he turned back to the shelf, pretending once again to read the labels. But inside his pulse had changed its rhythm, not from fear exactly, but from recognition. This wasn't about cereal anymore. It hadn't been for some time. And in that strange silence between suspicion and accusation, between a glance and a decision, Theo made a quiet promise to himself, not to prove anything, not to fight, not even to protect his name. Just to stand, as he always had, for the right to simply be. Deputy Kyle Riggins wasn't supposed to be here today. Not really here, not inside this store watching shoppers move past with half-empty carts and distracted expressions. But the shift assignment had changed last minute, and he had said yes, without thinking, just eager to get out of the station and into the field. He didn't like the slow days, the ones filled with paperwork and small talk, where all he could hear was the echo of his own thoughts bouncing around the locker room walls. The supermarket detail was supposed to be simple: walk the aisles, nod at the clerks, keep a presence, and yet even that kind of routine held a tension for Kyle, a persistent itch beneath the surface he couldn't quite name or ignore. He leaned against the wall near the front of the store at first, arms folded across his chest, trying to look like he belonged there, trying not to feel like the outsider he still was in this town. His boots were polished, his belt tight, every piece of his uniform pressed just so, but none of it settled the anxious edge that had followed him from the station that morning. He scanned the aisles not because he expected trouble, but because he didn't know what else to do with his eyes, and when he saw the tall, older man by the cereal black alone moving slow, his body reacted before his brain had the chance to explain why. It started as a flicker of irritation, the kind that had no clear cause, but latched on anyway, feeding off something half-learned and never questioned. The man wasn't doing anything wrong, wasn't even looking around suspiciously, and yet something in Kyle's gut tightened like a wire being pulled. He watched the way the man moved, measured, composed with a kind of grace Kyle didn't know how to interpret, and in the space where understanding should have been, suspicion took root. It wasn't logical, it wasn't fair, but it was there. He pushed off the wall and began walking without fully realizing why, his hand brushing the edge of his utility belt, mind racing ahead to how the encounter might unfold. Maybe the guy was shoplifting, maybe he was casing the place, maybe he wasn't doing anything at all, but Kyle didn't slow down. He told himself it was instinct, that something just felt off, the way officers always said when they needed a reason to act but didn't have one. That explanation had always been enough for his old training sergeant, who used to say, "It's better to be wrong and alive than right and sorry." But deep down, Kyle knew it wasn't just instinct, it was frustration. It was the weight of being the rookie, the outsider, in a department where no one quite respected him yet, not fully. He'd transferred from a smaller town that handled things differently, where people knew their place, and officers weren't second-guessed for doing what they felt was right. Here things were more political, more careful, and Kyle hated that kind of hesitation. He thought about the evaluation he had coming up, the notes about confidence issues and escalation awareness, and how badly he needed to prove he could take charge without asking permission. By the time he reached the aisle, he was already in character, chin raised slightly, chest forward, hand near his hip, his voice louder than it needed to be, his stance more rigid than the moment required. "Hey, "You there!" he barked and watched, as the older man turned with calm, unhurried movements, like he'd been through something like this before and was already tired of it. Their eyes met, and for a second, something faltered in Kyle. The man's gaze wasn't angry or nervous. It was steady, clear, and full of something that made Kyle feel like the younger one in every way that mattered. "Is there a problem, officer?" the man asked, and Kyle's jaw tensed, the question hitting harder than it should have. He didn't like the tone, not rude, not mocking, just confident. And confidence from someone who wasn't afraid of him felt like a challenge. He doubled down, asked the man what he was doing there, why he was loitering, if he had ID. Each question came sharper, less controlled, his voice climbing as if volume could make up for the lack of reason. The man didn't raise his voice. He just answered plainly, truthfully, calmly, and that calmness made Kyle feel like he was losing control. Inside, Kyle was spiraling. He could feel the stares from nearby customers, feel the flush rising to his neck, feel the gap widening between his suspicion and the reality in front of him. But instead of stepping back, instead of reassessing, he stepped forward. The fear of being wrong twisted into anger, and anger into assertion. "You don't look like you're from around here," he snapped, even as part of him wished he hadn't said it. The man's reply was quiet but firm. "I live here. I have rights." And just like that, something cracked open inside Kyle. Not a revelation, not remorse, but a desperate need to reassert control. He thought about all the ways this could go wrong, and none of them mattered as much as the feeling that he was being seen as weak. He couldn't afford that. Not now. Not again. He put his hand on the butt of his gun, not drawing it, not yet, but enough to send a message. "You're resisting," he said, though the words felt brittle as they left his mouth. "No," the man replied, voice low, hands still at his sides. "I'm standing." And in that moment, Kyle felt more exposed than ever, because he wasn't dealing with a criminal, wasn't facing a threat, wasn't correcting disorder. He was confronting his own need to feel powerful, and the man in front of him had dismantled that with nothing but words. But instead of stepping down, Kyle tightened his grip, already too deep to retreat, without losing something he wasn't ready to let go of. Respect, control, his place in the uniform. So he stayed, even as the aisle grew quieter, even as his hands began to shake, even as the man's silence told him everything his training never had. There are moments when time does not slow down so much as it sharpens, when each breath feels like a blade being drawn quietly from its sheath, and each heartbeat becomes a question asking whether it will be the last. That was the moment Theo Brooks found himself in, standing still between shelves of brightly colored cereal boxes and rows of off-brand oatmeal, facing a young officer whose fear had morphed into something far more dangerous than confusion. The silence that wrapped around them wasn't empty. It was taut, heavy with electricity, as if the entire supermarket had been pulled into the tight pause between decision and disaster. Theo hadn't moved in nearly a minute, but his mind had mapped every inch of the space in front of him. He saw the fluorescent light reflected in the polished tile at their feet, heard the low hum of the freezers behind him, and caught a glimpse of two shoppers lingering at the end of the aisle, frozen by the rising tension they didn't yet understand. The officer Riggins, he now remembered from the nameplate, had shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the subtle twitch of a man unsteady on moral ground, but gripping power like it was the only thing keeping him upright. Theo had trained men like him before, too young, too eager, too brittle to carry the authority they wore on their chests. The air tasted metallic now, the kind of weight you feel just before a storm. Theo's hands remained at chest-level, fingers splayed slightly, palms facing forward, in the universal posture of submission that never felt anything close to peace. "Officer," he said, his voice low but clear, slicing through the tension with restraint so precise it could only come from long practice, "you're making a serious mistake." But Riggins wasn't listening. Or if he was hearing only what his fear allowed him to hear. His right hand was now fully gripping the handle of his sidearm thumb, brushing the safety knuckles pale. His mouth was tight, jaw clenched, and the corners of his eyes twitched in a rhythm that spoke of internal chaos, conflict between training insecurity and the intoxication of power unchallenged. "Don't move," he shouted suddenly, his voice cracking just slightly, but loud enough to startle the woman pushing a cart one aisle over. Theo didn't flinch. Not because he wasn't afraid he was, but because fear, when honed over years, stops manifesting as movement. It settles instead into the breath, into posture, into a stillness so practiced it becomes armor. "I haven't moved," he replied calmly, eyes steady, breathing even, "and I'm not going to, but I'd like to speak to your supervisor." That sentence, gentle as it was, seemed to strike something raw in Riggins. His pupils narrowed, his shoulders squared, and then in one sharp, irrevocable motion the gun came out of its holster. It wasn't pointed downward in warning. It wasn't aimed at the floor or held in reserve. It was leveled straight, centered at Theo's chest. The gun looked massive in that moment, more like a sentence than a tool, its black mouth open and waiting for silence to become tragedy. Theo saw the barrel, but what he focused on was the tremor in the young man's fingers, the almost imperceptible shake that betrayed a lack of control. That more than the gun itself was what made Theo's stomach clench. Because it wasn't hatred behind that weapon, it was fear so deep and confused it had forgotten how to reason. "Put your hands up," Riggins yelled, voice cracking again, raw with panic. "I said put your hands up." "They are up," Theo said softly, almost like he was reminding the officer of a detail he'd forgotten in the fog of his own escalation. "They've been up this whole time." Around them the world had gone silent. The song on the store speakers had cut to a quiet instrumental interlude, and the soft beep of a distant register seemed suddenly intrusive and surreal. A small child, barely visible behind the shelves, whispered something to their mother, and the mother pulled the child close and backed away down another aisle. Theo's arms were starting to ache from holding them up so long, but he didn't lower them. He knew the cost of gestures misread by the wrong eyes. What troubled him more wasn't the fear. He felt he was no stranger to fear, but the knowledge that nothing he could say would shift the narrative that had already taken root in this officer's mind. He had been cast in a role he hadn't auditioned for, and now the script was being written by a man whose authority outpaced his understanding. He considered flashing his credentials. He had done it before, produced a badge, spoken in a measured tone, let the weight of federal status snap others back into reality. But not this time. Not while a weapon was already drawn, not while adrenaline was dancing in the young man's bloodstream like gasoline waiting for a spark. Officer Theo said again with a steadiness that belied the tension in his muscles. "I don't know what you think I've done, but I promise you you're going to regret this if you don't step back." Riggins's lips parted, but he didn't respond. His finger hovered near the trigger, not resting on it, but not far either. He looked like a man trying to decide whether to listen or to double down. And that hesitation, that dangerous silence, became the most volatile part of the moment. Theo breathed in slowly, once, twice, and said the only name that could shift this. "I need you to call Chief Delaney." At that, Riggins blinked. Just once. The name hit something inside him, perhaps familiarity, perhaps confusion, but not enough to lower the weapon. "You think that scares me?" he spat. "You think name-dropping the chief is going to change anything?" "No," Theo answered. "But I think she'll be interested to know what's happening in aisle 6. And for the first time since the standoff began, a flicker of uncertainty crossed the officer's face. It wasn't much, but it was something. Theo held on to it, not as a victory, but as a crack in the door. He knew he couldn't control how this ended, but he could control what came next. So he did the only thing he could. He said nothing. He stood, and he waited. In the small, trembling space between fear and reason, Theo Brooks made a decision not out of anger or panic, but out of a lifetime's worth of measured survival. His hands remained in the air, his chest rising slowly as he breathed through the tension like a man pacing his heartbeats, careful not to give the wrong impression with something as simple as a shift of weight. The barrel of the gun was still pointed directly at him, and though the young officer's eyes had begun to falter, his grip remained iron-tight, like he was afraid that loosening his fingers would mean letting go of something more than just control. Theo had been in rooms where actual criminals had threatened lives, had trained agents on how to negotiate with armed suspects, had once talked a desperate man out of jumping from a courthouse ledge. But nothing, not the hostage drills, not the terrorism briefings, not even the late-night field missions, had prepared him for what it felt like to be seen as the danger by someone who was supposed to protect him. The ache in his arms was building, and yet he held them there steady and open, not just as a defense, but as a mirror to the absurdity of what the moment had become. He didn't want to speak again unless he had to. Words misused could be tinder in a dry forest, and he could see the kindling in the officer's flushed face and darting gaze. But he also knew that silence, if too long, could be mistaken for defiance. So instead of pleading or posturing, Theo did the only thing that might cut through the fog of ego and adrenaline. He reached for the truth that outranked every badge in that building. "I'm going to call your chief," he said calmly, as if he were asking someone for directions rather than trying to save both their lives. Riggins blinked hard, his brow furrowing in disbelief. "What did you just say?" "I said I'm calling Chief Martha Delaney," Theo repeated, letting the name hang in the air like a thread pulled tight. "She knows who I am. You're going to want to let me make that call." There was a pause, a visible shift in the young man's posture. His gun didn't lower, but his wrists slackened just slightly, like doubt had started to edge its way into the space where certainty used to sit. Theo seized the moment, not physically, not rashly, but with the calm of a man who knew that timing could mean everything. He moved slowly, so slowly. It felt like an act of faith, not in the officer, but in the hope that someone else still held the reins of justice somewhere beyond that aisle. "My phone is in my left pocket," he said, never raising his voice, never looking away. "I'm going to reach for it now. You'll see every movement. You can stop me if you need to." The officer said nothing. He simply stood there, jaw-clenched eyes, tracking Theo's every breath. But he didn't stop him. Theo moved his right hand first, lowering it inch by inch, keeping it in plain sight the way he had trained others to do. His fingertips brushed the fabric of his blazer, found the edge of his phone, and slowly pulled it free. The screen lit up against his palm like a lighthouse in a storm. No sudden moves, no misread intentions, just a quiet man holding a lifeline. He opened his contacts and scrolled to a name he had dialed dozens of times, but never under circumstances like this. Martha Delaney, former academy trainee, current interim chief, a woman whose steady rise had been built on empathy, reason, and a refusal to back down when truth stood in front of her. He tapped her name and switched to speaker, before lifting the phone just a few inches from his chest. It rang once, then again, and then that voice, warm, crisp, and unmistakably in command. "Theo," she said. "What's going on?" He exhaled, not relief, not yet, but a breath that told his body it had not been forgotten. "I'm at the Fresh Lane Market, aisle 6. One of your officers has me at gunpoint." The silence on her end was immediate and ice-cold. No sound, no movement. Then, like a match struck in darkness, her tone changed. "What? Which officer?" "Name tag says Riggins." Theo replied, his voice steady but edged with weariness. "Young, white, hand shaking, gun still up." Riggins heard every word. His face turned a shade paler, his stance unsteady now, as if the ground beneath him had finally started to shift. He didn't say anything, perhaps couldn't, but his hand wavered at last. "I'm leaving the station now," Martha said sharply. "You stay where you are. Do not move. I'll be there in 3 minutes." The call ended. The wait in the aisle remained, but something in the air had shifted. Not relief, not resolution. Just the tension of a fuse that had not yet burned out but was no longer climbing. Theo slowly returned his arm to its former position, holding the phone against his chest like a relic of reason. Riggins lowered his gun, not all the way, not immediately, but the direction of the barrel had softened, no longer squarely aimed at Theo's heart. His mouth opened, but no words came out, just a breath ragged and afraid. Theo said nothing more. There was nothing left to say until someone else arrived, someone with the authority to see what this moment really meant, not just for him, but for every man who had stood quietly in his own neighborhood and been forced to prove he belonged. He held the silence now, not as surrender but as testimony, and he waited. The sound of the supermarket doors parting wasn't loud, but somehow it sliced through the air like the crack of dry ice in warm water, subtle but arresting. Even before the footsteps echoed on the linoleum floor, Theo knew she had arrived. There was a particular cadence to the way Martha Delaney walked, shoulders slightly forward, chin set with quiet certainty, each step measured not in speed but in presence. She didn't rush, she never had. She understood that real authority didn't need to barrel in to be felt. It announced itself the moment it entered a room. And as she stepped past the floral section and into the line of fluorescent lights stretching over aisle 6, that presence wrapped the space in something colder than confrontation, accountability. She wore plain clothes, as always. No uniform, no badge on display. Just a dark navy windbreaker, her chestnut hair pulled back in a tight bun, the corners of her mouth drawn into a line, so still it looked carved. Her eyes moved quickly but deliberately, scanning for Theo, first before even acknowledging the officer with the drawn weapon. When she spotted him, arms still partially raised, phone still in hand, shoulders squared. Despite the fatigue, her expression changed almost imperceptibly. Not shock, not surprise, but something heavier, something like disappointment colliding with restrained fury. She walked straight toward him, brushing past a stunned store employee who had been frozen mid-step with a carton of eggs in his hand. Her boots hit the floor with the kind of rhythm that silences chatter and sends whispers scattering like birds startled from wire. And when she stopped in front of Theo, she didn't ask what happened, she already knew. Her eyes swept him up and down in one fluid glance, as if confirming he was physically unharmed before anything else. "Are you all right?" she asked, voice low and firm, like a private question, asked publicly but meant sincerely. Theo gave a small nod, the kind that held both gratitude and unspoken weight. He didn't pull the trigger, he said simply, and that was all the context she needed. Only then did she turn to Riggins. If Theo's silence had been an indictment, Martha's stare was a trial in itself. She looked at the young officer, not with hostility, but with the clinical precision of someone who had seen this before and was already cataloging the damage. Riggins, who had been gripping his weapon with a trembling hand just moments earlier, now looked like a man caught halfway through a lie that had grown too large to control. His face was pale, his mouth parted slightly, as though searching for a sentence that wouldn't bury him deeper. But Martha gave him no space to speak first. "Officer Riggins," she said, the words ringing with restrained command. "What exactly do you think you're doing? Pointing a loaded firearm at a federal trainer and respected civilian in the middle of a grocery store?" Her voice didn't rise, didn't waver, but it cut through the quiet like tempered steel. Riggins blinked rapidly as if trying to reset time or memory, but both had moved on without him. "Chief, I didn't know who he was," he stammered. "He was acting suspicious, I thought." "You thought," she interrupted, her tone sharpening just slightly, "that a tall black man picking out cereal was a threat." The silence that followed was merciless. Martha stepped closer, not aggressively, but with purpose. "Let me be absolutely clear," she continued, her voice lower now, meant only for those standing within the wreckage of the moment. "You pointed a weapon at a man with no cause, no backup, and no legal foundation, then escalated that into a public spectacle, rooted in nothing but your own bias." Riggins lowered his eyes, his shoulders slumping under the weight of each syllable. Theo watched, not with glee or vengeance, but with the quiet composure of someone who had lived long enough to know that justice, when it comes, rarely feels like triumph. It feels like necessary correction. Martha's gaze flicked to his holstered weapon. "Disarm yourself, now." The command wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Her voice had already reshaped the space, drawn every eye, every breath into a new alignment. Riggins hesitated just for a second, but then slowly unlatched the holster, removed the firearm, and handed it over. His hands shook as he did, and Martha took it with both gravity and restraint, holding it like the symbol of failure it had become. "Your badge and radio too," she added. This time Riggins didn't speak. He simply reached for his belt, unhooked the badge, clipped to his hip, and placed it next to the gun with quiet finality. His radio followed. The snap of the Velcro as it came loose seemed louder than anything else in the store. When she had them all in hand, Martha turned and handed the equipment to a nearby officer who had arrived silently, waiting near the end of the aisle, with two others who had followed protocol rather than panic. "Escort Officer Riggins back to the station," she said. "He's suspended effective immediately. No further discussion." As Riggins was led away, his boots heavy, his face gray, his breath shallow, Martha didn't watch him go. Instead, she turned back to Theo and stood there for a long moment without saying a word. It wasn't until the aisle had cleared a bit, until the murmurs had softened and the tension had bled from the walls, that she finally spoke again. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I wish I could say this. Surprises me." Theo looked at her with tired eyes, the kind that had seen too many versions of this play out. "It doesn't surprise me either," he replied. "But it still stings." They stood there for another beat, two people shaped by the same institution in different ways, bound by a shared knowledge of how easily it can fail if left unchallenged. No victory, no applause, just a moment reclaimed. And then together they walked out of the aisle where power had been pointed the wrong way and was finally turned around. The sound of Riggins' boots echoed unevenly down the polished tile as he was escorted away, badge gone, weapon surrendered, reputation unraveling with each reluctant step, and for a moment the supermarket felt less like a place of commerce and more like the hollow shell of a courtroom after the verdict had been spoken. People didn't move right away. They lingered behind carts, peeked from the ends of aisles, eyes still wide from witnessing something both shocking and oddly quiet: justice, delivered not in a burst of violence, but in the controlled tone of a leader who refused to look away. Theo remained standing in the same spot, arms finally lowered, though a dull ache lingered in the muscles from holding them aloft for so long. His heart had begun to slow, but it hadn't yet settled. There was a strange stillness in his chest, not relief, not vindication, just the kind of tired that sinks into the bones and doesn't leave quickly. He turned toward Martha as she took a step closer, her face tight, not with anger now, but with a grief that didn't need words. "Thank you," he said, simply, his voice quieter than before, rough around the edges like it had been scraped by the silence too long. She didn't nod, didn't brush it off like a duty fulfilled. She just held his gaze and breathed once through her nose before replying, "I don't get points for doing what should already be expected." The words landed between them like something that had been waiting years to be said. They both understood the weight of that truth, that too often people cheered when someone in power did the bare minimum to correct the unforgivable. And yet in that moment, neither of them leaned into bitterness. They let the truth sit there not as a wound, but as a mark they could both see clearly. Around them, store employees had begun whispering among themselves, and one of the assistant managers, a young woman with a walkie-talkie clipped to her belt, approached carefully, her voice tentative. "Do you want us to call anyone else? Maybe the city, legal?" Martha turned her head slightly, gave a small but firm shake. "We'll handle it internally for now. Just make sure the security footage is preserved." The woman nodded and stepped back, her eyes darting between the chief and Theo, as though unsure which one she was more afraid of disappointing. In the distance, a mother wheeled her son away from the scene, murmuring something soft, as the child turned for one last glance at the man who had stood still while danger stared him down. Theo caught the boy's eyes, big, curious, unafraid, and he felt something twist inside him, not from pain, but from the quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, the boy would remember this moment for what it truly meant. Martha turned back to Theo and motioned gently with her hand. "Come with me. Let's finish this in the light." They walked side by side through the aisles, passing shelves of bread and soda, as if walking through the remains of a theater stage after the play had ended. The colors of the store seemed too bright now, the overhead lights too artificial, as if the illusion of normalcy couldn't quite mask what had just happened. Outside, the late afternoon sun had slipped behind a line of clouds, casting long shadows across the pavement and turning the parking lot into a maze of slanted gold. By the time they reached the front doors, 2 more patrol cars had arrived, their lights off, their presence quiet but unmistakable. Martha stepped aside to speak with one of the senior officers, giving calm but firm instructions that sounded more like resolutions than orders. Theo stood nearby, watching her move, watching how the others leaned in, not out of fear but respect. He remembered the first time she had sat in his class years ago, a young woman with sharp questions and an even sharper sense of when to stay silent and listen. And now here she was, standing taller than any badge could make her, not just because of her rank, but because she had chosen to wield it with purpose. When she finished speaking, she returned to Theo and crossed her arms loosely, the wind stirring the edge of her jacket. "I'll be filing the suspension officially tonight," she said. "IA will start in the morning, and I'll see to it that he never carries a badge in this town again." Theo gave a slow nod, but his eyes didn't light up. "That's right," he murmured. "But this isn't just about me. I know," she said, her voice low. "It's about everyone he would have done this to if no one was watching. That's why I have to act, because next time it won't be someone who knows what to say. They both stood there, the late light wrapping around them like the last breath of a long day, and for a moment neither one moved. There was nothing left to do in that moment but recognize what had happened and what nearly had. Martha broke the silence again, more softly this time. "You're going to be asked if you want to press charges." Theo looked off toward the sidewalk where the patrol cars sat, then back toward the store windows where a few lingering shoppers pretended not to be watching. "I haven't decided yet," he admitted. "What I want more than anything is for him to know that what he did can't be undone. Not with apologies, not with tears. I want him to feel the weight of what almost was." Martha nodded again, slower this time, then placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, just enough to say, "I hear you, I see you," without needing to spell it out. And as she stepped away, walking back toward the officers, toward paperwork and procedures and statements that would soon replace the memory of raised voices and pointed weapons, Theo stood quietly at the edge of the sidewalk. Not as a victim, not as a man seeking revenge, but as a reminder that dignity, when held firm, can become its own kind of resistance. And for the first time that day, he closed his eyes, not to escape, but to rest. The next morning, the air in the station felt thicker than usual, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Every desk lamp seemed too bright, every footstep too loud, and every sideways glance a little too careful. Inside the small office marked Internal Affairs, a folder with the name Kyle Riggins, in bold type, lay open on the desk, its contents growing by the hour. Chief Martha Delaney had arrived earlier than usual, bypassing her own office, to sit in on the first round of conversations. This wasn't going to be a long, drawn-out performance. She didn't believe in dragging truth through bureaucracy when the facts were already bleeding out into the daylight. Theo hadn't come to the station that day, though he'd been offered the opportunity to make a formal statement in person. Instead, he sent in a detailed written account, clear, steady, and stripped of embellishment. It was exactly the kind of report he had taught others to write in the academy, factual, chronological, and impossible to distort. In it, he described the moment Riggins first made contact, the escalating suspicion without probable cause, and the weapon that was eventually drawn, despite the total absence of threat. He recounted every word spoken not to condemn with emotion, but to document behavior that had crossed every professional line. And yet even with the written testimony, the station still buzzed with discomfort, as if the officers weren't sure whether to rally behind their chief or brace for blowback. But Martha knew what needed to happen, and she had no intention of softening it. She had seen this before, not just in cases but in the cracks that form slowly in a department's trust when an incident is swept under the rug. She had sworn long ago never to be the kind of leader who patched the surface while the rot spread beneath it. As she sat across from the Internal Affairs investigator that morning, she folded her hands carefully on the table and asked one simple question. "How many prior complaints have we received about Riggins, formal or informal?" The officer flipped through a thin stack of files, his face unreadable. "2 written notes in the last 6 months," he replied. "Both from civilians. No formal follow-up. A few verbal concerns from fellow officers, but nothing recorded." "Nothing recorded," she repeated, letting those words hang in the space between them. That's how it always began. Whispers instead of reports, caution instead of action, and then one moment where everything finally boiled over into something the public could no longer ignore. By midday, the store had already provided their security footage, including time-stamped video from multiple angles. Martha sat with her deputy and 2 IA investigators in a small, darkened room, watching as the camera followed Theo through the aisles, his steps calm and deliberate, his posture unthreatening. There was no audio, but it didn't matter. The footage didn't need dialogue. They watched Riggins approach, posture rigid, shoulders squared in a way that screamed aggression even before his mouth had moved. They watched him draw his gun, saw the way Theo's hands rose slowly in response. Palms open, stance still. It was all there. And yet Martha felt no triumph in seeing it. Afterward, the team compiled additional witness statements from customers and employees who had been present. Some described the tension, others described fear. But nearly all of them said the same thing. The older man didn't raise his voice, didn't move suddenly, didn't provoke anything. The younger officer looked nervous, jumpy, loud. "It didn't feel right," one cashier said. "It felt like watching someone try to prove something that wasn't even there." That sentence stayed with Martha for the rest of the afternoon. Because that was exactly what it was, an officer trying to justify a feeling that had never been rooted in fact. It reminded her of something Theo had once said when she was still a cadet. Bias doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just points. And in this case, it had pointed a gun. Later that evening, she sat alone in her office, reading over the final draft of the preliminary report. It outlined the key violations: unlawful escalation without reasonable suspicion, excessive use of force, failure to follow protocol, and racially motivated assumptions. The language was formal, but the meaning was devastating. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a pattern that had gone uncorrected until it threatened someone's life. She stared out the window. As the sun dipped behind the trees, the warm light staining the sky in shades of gold and rust. The silence in her office wasn't peaceful, it was reflective, haunted by what almost happened and weighted with what still had to be done. She picked up her phone and dialed Theo. He answered after 2 rings, his voice even but edged with something cautious. "Chief, I wanted to let you know we've concluded the initial review," she said. "It's being escalated to a disciplinary hearing." "Thank you," he replied, and then after a pause, "I hope it means something." "It does," she said. "But I know that's not always enough." For a moment, neither spoke. Then he added quietly, "If it hadn't been me, if it had been someone younger, someone without connections." "I know," she said again, the words heavier this time. "That's why we're doing this the right way. Not just for you." As she ended the call and set the phone back on her desk, Martha understood this would follow the department for a long time. It would shape how people looked at her leadership, how they measured her words when she spoke of reform and accountability. But she also knew that this was the line, this was the place where a leader chooses whether to protect the system or rebuild it from the rot. And she had already made her choice. The room where the disciplinary board convened was quiet, not silent, not tense, just steady, in the way that rooms become when everyone inside understands that what's about to be said carries weight that won't be forgotten. The long oak table was polished, but its shine didn't soften the nature of the gathering. It simply reflected the gravity in the eyes of those seated around it. Chief Martha Delaney sat at the head, her spine straight, but not stiff, her hands folded in front of her like a judge, preparing to weigh a matter both personal and professional. To her left was the internal affairs investigator, flanked by 2 senior officers who had reviewed the files, watched the footage, and now waited for final statements before issuing a decision that could not be undone. In front of them sat Kyle Riggins, no longer in uniform, no badge clipped to his chest, no firearm at his side, just a plain button-down shirt and a posture that struggled to find the right balance between remorse and self-preservation. His lawyer sat beside him, a man in his 40s with a calm demeanor and a folder of arguments he hadn't quite decided whether to use aggressively or carefully. They had both seen the footage. They had both read the report. There would be no denial here, only an attempt to shape the narrative into something less damning than it already was. Riggins' eyes flicked across the room at the empty chair that might have held Theo Brooks had he chosen to attend in person, and at the printed copy of Theo's written statement that lay quietly on the table like a testament with no need for a voice. The words were precise, unwavering, and most damning of all, calm. There was no outrage in Theo's statement, no accusatory flourish, just a clear outline of what had happened and what could have happened if the moment had gone any further. He didn't shoot the statement read, but he was closer to doing so than he ever had the right to be. Martha looked at Riggins, then her gaze steady, not cruel, but unflinching. "Officer Riggins," she said, pausing to let the title land, "with its full context, you've had the chance to review all evidence submitted. Is there anything you'd like to say before we make our recommendation?" Riggins shifted in his seat, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles looked pale. He swallowed, then glanced briefly at his attorney before beginning. "I made a mistake," he said, voice low. Each word weighed heavily in his mouth. "I misread the situation. I let my instincts take over, and I acted too aggressively. I didn't know who Mr. Brooks was." Martha didn't flinch at that line. She'd heard it before. So had everyone else in the room. And yet, she let him continue. "I thought he was suspicious," Riggins said, his voice gaining a little strength as if leaning into the familiar rhythm of explanation. "He didn't seem like he belonged there. He looked like he was waiting for something or hiding something. I know now that wasn't true, but in the moment, I didn't see a calm shopper. I saw a threat. He stopped there, and for a brief second, the room seemed to shrink around that last sentence. I saw a threat. That was the entire issue, wasn't it? That was the root. Not training, not protocol, perception, bias. A young officer saw a threat where there was none, and the cost of that mistake, had it ended differently, could have been a man's life. Martha leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but unyielding. Do you understand now that what you saw wasn't about him, it was about you? Riggins hesitated, the words catching somewhere between honesty and fear. I think so, he said quietly. That's not enough. One of the senior officers interjected, voice sharp but not raised. You had no prior alert, no probable cause, no report. You initiated a confrontation based on a feeling, one you never stopped to question. The internal affairs investigator turned a page in his binder and spoke without looking up. The footage clearly shows Mr. Brooks did nothing to provoke the encounter. His movements were normal, his posture non-threatening, his voice calm throughout. You escalated the situation without justification, drew your weapon in a public place, and maintained that threat in front of civilians. This wasn't a lapse in judgment, it was a breach of protocol, a breach of ethics, and an act rooted in implicit bias. Riggins looked down at the table. His lawyer touched his elbow but didn't speak. The board members conferred briefly in low voices, the room dimming under the weight of what had already been decided. It wasn't personal, not for them, not for Martha. It was professional, necessary. A line had been crossed, and if no action followed, the line would dissolve entirely. When Martha spoke again, her voice was quiet, but it carried like a gavel strike. This department is charged with protecting this community, not policing it with fear. Officer Riggins, your actions endangered a man who did nothing wrong. They undermined public trust. They exposed a weakness in our system that we are now obligated to repair. She took a breath, letting her words settle in everyone's chest. Effective immediately, you are hereby terminated from the department. You will not be eligible for rehire, nor will you be recommended for law enforcement positions elsewhere. The formal decision will be filed with state certification authorities within the week. The sentence wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. It was simply final. Riggins looked stunned, as if he'd imagined there would be another way out, some compromise that might save his career, or at least its shell. But there wasn't. Not this time. As the board stood and the room began to empty, Martha stayed seated, her hands still folded, her eyes lingering for a moment on the place where Theo's name sat printed in black ink. She thought about what he had said in his statement, "This isn't about me. It's about who comes next." And that was why this mattered. Not because of who Theo was, or even what could have happened to him, but because of who wouldn't survive the next time if nothing was done now. And so, as the doors closed behind the last departing member, Martha exhaled slowly, the weight in her chest shifting, not gone, not yet, but lighter than the silence that had once lived there. The hallway outside the hearing room smelled faintly of old wood and institutional coffee, the kind that sat too long on a burner, slowly turning bitter with time. Theo stood there alone for a moment, after it was all over, his back to the wall, eyes cast downward, not in defeat but in a kind of reflective pause. The verdict had been handed down, the words spoken with the clinical precision of an administrative body, trying to balance truth and procedure, and yet it hadn't felt final, not in the way people expected closure to feel. There were no cheers, no applause, no justice that rose up and wrapped itself in satisfaction. There was only the quiet echo of footsteps, the rustle of papers being gathered, and the weight of what had been avoided but never fully undone. The building itself hummed with low mechanical life, air vents clicking on and off, fluorescent lights humming above like distant insects. It was late in the day, the kind of late that stretches out shadows and reminds people to go home, but Theo lingered. He didn't need to be there anymore. His role had been completed, his words submitted, his presence accounted for in the ripple effect of what had followed. But part of him felt rooted to the floor, as if walking away would somehow lessen the meaning of what had been exposed beneath those cold ceiling panels and official titles. Martha appeared a few minutes later, her jacket unbuttoned, a manila folder tucked under her arm, and a look on her face that balanced weariness with a flicker of something steady and grounded. She didn't speak at first, just walked up beside him and leaned against the same wall, letting the silence stretch comfortably between them. For a few breaths, they were just two people standing in a hallway, stripped of titles, stripped of what the city knew them as, stripped even of what had passed between them in that grocery store aisle. Eventually she broke the silence, her voice low and calm. "I know that wasn't easy." Theo nodded slowly, not because he needed to agree, but because truth didn't require embellishment. "No, it wasn't, but it was necessary. I've reviewed every second of the footage a dozen times," she said, shifting the folder in her hands. "There's not a frame where you look like a threat. Not one moment that justifies what he did." Theo let out a breath through his nose, part chuckle, part sigh. "It wasn't about what I looked like, Martha. It was about what he saw when he wasn't thinking. That's the part that scares me most." She turned her head just slightly toward him, her expression open but heavy. "You could have pressed charges," she said. "You still could." I know he said the words landing without edge. "But I didn't need his life ruined. I needed it stopped." There was a pause, short but meaningful, before he continued. "I needed him out of that uniform before someone ended up dead. And if I'd taken him to court, it would have turned into a circus. People would have stopped listening to the facts and started picking sides." Martha nodded again, more slowly this time, as if weighing his reasoning with the same quiet diligence she had applied to the hearing. "You did what you've always done," she said. "You chose the outcome that protects the most people, even if it doesn't heal you." Theo smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Healing isn't the point. Accountability is." Outside the narrow window at the end of the hallway, dusk had begun to settle over the parking lot, painting long shadows across empty spaces and casting the streetlights in a soft, anticipatory glow. Somewhere far off, a car door slammed. A burst of laughter floated through from a sidewalk, and life, as it always did, went on, unaware, uninterested in the reckonings happening behind municipal walls. Martha shifted her weight, then turned toward him fully. "Do you regret anything?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes followed a crack in the floor tile that had probably been there for years, unnoticed, unpatched. "I regret that it had to happen," he said eventually. "I regret that I wasn't surprised." She tilted her head gently, asking without words if there was more. "I spent years teaching officers how to stay calm, how to recognize fear in themselves before it spilled onto someone else," he continued. "And still I found myself standing in a grocery store with a gun pointed at me by someone who looked at me and saw danger. Not because of what I did, just because of who I am." His voice didn't break. It didn't rise. It simply existed in the space between them, like an old truth that had grown tired of being ignored. And yet he added, "I'm still here. And he's not wearing a badge anymore. That has to mean something." Martha placed the folder she'd been carrying on a bench nearby and crossed her arms loosely over her chest. "It does," she said. "It means we have work to do. Still. Always." Theo looked over at her, and this time the corner of his mouth curved up, not quite a smile, but close. "Then let's get back to it." They left the hallway together, not as symbols, not even as colleagues bound by duty, but as two people carrying the shared burden of knowing how fragile the system was and how essential it was to keep fighting for the people who would never get the chance to speak for themselves. As the elevator doors slid closed behind them, the building seemed to exhale, and the silence they left behind wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had chosen not to let stay hidden. Weeks passed, and the headlines faded in the way they always do, slowly, then all at once replaced by newer stories, different outrages, and louder tragedies. The incident at Fresh Lane Market never made it beyond the borders of the town, but it didn't have to. Within the station, within the community, and especially within the tight-knit circles of law enforcement training programs where Theo Brooks's name still carried quiet weight, the story echoed with the kind of persistence that formal press could never achieve. People talked, not in shouting matches or viral posts, but in private conversations, classroom lectures, hallway whispers, the kind of talk that suggests something had cracked open and couldn't be sealed back shut. Theo didn't return to the market. Not because he was afraid or ashamed, but because something in him resisted the idea of walking the same aisle under the same lights as if to measure the exact coordinates where his dignity had been tested. Instead, he returned to his classroom. Not a real classroom. Not anymore, he was long retired from the academy, but the kind of informal settings where experience teaches louder than textbooks, community centers, cadet workshops, quiet sit-downs with new recruits who didn't know in his story but sensed he had lived something worth hearing. He never opened with what happened. That wasn't his way. He let the lessons come from questions, from scenarios, from the slow unfolding of ideas that most young officers had never been asked to consider. He'd pose a question, "What does fear look like to you?" and wait in the silence until someone answered honestly. And when they did, he would ask again, "And how does your fear change depending on who's in front of you?" In those quiet spaces, he could see change start to spark, not in grand transformations, but in pauses, in eye contact, in the subtle shift when a young officer realized they had never been taught to question what they saw as suspicious. Sometimes they pushed back. Sometimes they asked if he was trying to make them feel guilty. And every time Theo would smile and say, "Number, I'm trying to help you carry the badge, without hurting someone who looks like me." The work wasn't fast and it wasn't glamorous, but it mattered. Meanwhile, Chief Martha Delaney began what she privately referred to as the long cleanup. Internally, she launched a department-wide review of use-of-force policies, not just for compliance, but for cultural accountability, language, assumptions, behaviors that slipped under the radar but shaped the way officers acted when in the field. She brought in outside consultants. She opened the doors to community feedback. She met resistance, of course, quiet eye rolls from the old guard, thinly veiled complaints about political correctness, but she didn't flinch. Not this time. She also did something else, something few people knew about. She started recording short weekly memos, video reflections no longer than 5 minutes addressed not to the public but to her officers. In them, she didn't talk about policy or stats. She talked about responsibility, about perception, about the burden and the privilege of being given the power to enforce the law. One week she spoke directly to what happened with Theo, not naming him but making clear that something had happened on her watch that nearly cost a man his life. "It won't be forgotten," she said, her voice steady in the camera. "And it won't be repeated." Theo watched that video. Someone sent it to him. And when it ended, he sat alone in his study, the room bathed in the soft afternoon light that fell through half-closed blinds, and he didn't speak for several minutes. He just let the stillness hold him. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't justice. But it was something. Something rare. A public servant speaking the truth without being forced to. A leader choosing ownership over distance. Later that week, Theo returned to his volunteer session with a new class of cadets, and for the first time he told them the story. He didn't dramatize it. He didn't name names. He just walked them through what it felt like, what it truly felt like to be perceived as a threat in a place where you were simply living. He told them about the weight of standing still with your hands in the air, about the silence that follows a gun being drawn, about the hollow in your chest when the person holding it doesn't see your humanity, only their fear. The room stayed silent for a long time afterward. Then one cadet, a young woman, maybe 22, freckles, ponytail, nervous hands, asked, "What kept you calm?" And Theo looked at her, his voice quiet but certain, and said, "Because I've lived long enough to know that if I don't stay calm, I don't stay alive." No one spoke after that. They didn't need to. And when the session ended, several of them stayed behind, not to ask questions, but to simply say thank you. Not as a formality, but as something closer to reverence. Later that night, Theo sat at his kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling between his palms, his wife humming softly as she moved through the room behind him. He thought about how close it had come, how close it always comes. And he thought about how even now, even after everything, the work was never truly done. But he was still here. And because he was still here, he would keep showing up, one lesson at a time. The morning after the storm had fully passed, Theo stepped into his backyard just as the light was breaking through the branches overhead, painting long amber strokes across the grass still wet with dew. The world was quiet in that way. It often is before the rest of the neighborhood wakes up. No traffic yet, no barking dogs. Only the gentle rustle of wind moving through the leaves like a breath being held and slowly released. He carried a mug of coffee in one hand, his other resting loosely in the pocket of his jacket, and for a while he didn't move. just stood still, watching the early sunlight crawl across the garden beds. His wife had tended for years with a patient, loving hand. The roses were beginning to bloom again, deep crimson, soft blush, a white one that had refused to grow for 3 seasons now, stretching open as if finally deciding it was safe to show itself. He crouched down beside it, ran his fingers gently across the edge of a petal, then sat on the small wooden bench at the corner of the yard, the one with the cracked armrest and the faded inscription they had carved into it the first spring, after they'd moved in. It read simply, "Still here." He smiled at the sight of it, not out of joy or even nostalgia, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who understood the value of presence, not power, not pride, just the act of staying. He thought about how close things had come to ending differently, not just for him but for the young man who had nearly pulled a trigger without understanding what it meant. He didn't feel bitterness anymore, not exactly. There had been anger, of course. There had been shame, confusion, weariness. But now, sitting in his backyard with the sun warming his shoulders and the distant sound of a lawnmower starting 2 houses over, what Theo felt most of all was clarity. Not all justice comes wrapped in a headline or shouted in the streets. Sometimes it shows up in the form of what doesn't happen: a life not taken, a silence not broken by a shot, a community not plunged into mourning. His phone buzzed quietly in his pocket. He pulled it out and saw a message from a cadet he'd spoken to just 2 days earlier, a young man named Malik, fresh-faced and unsure, who had stayed after class with a single question: "How do you carry all this without it crushing you?" Theo had answered him with something honest: "Because I've learned how to set it down when I need to." The message now simply read, "Thank you. I get it now." That was all. But Theo read it twice, then put the phone away without replying. Some things didn't need responses to be complete. From inside the house, his wife called out that breakfast was ready, her voice soft, but carrying the gentle authority he had come to rely on in ways too quiet to name. He called back that he'd be in shortly, but stayed where he was for a moment longer, letting the cool air wrap around his legs and the heat from his coffee spread slowly through his hands. This bench had held him through every season of his life: grief, celebration, quiet reflection, unspoken prayers, and today it held him again, not because he was broken, but because he had chosen not to carry the weight alone anymore. He thought of Martha Delaney, what it had cost her to stand firm, what she still had to fight through behind closed doors, where the old rules whispered louder than truth. He respected her not because she had done what was expected, but because she had gone further. She had faced down the easy way out and chosen discomfort, scrutiny, and transformation instead. That he knew was the mark of real leadership, not perfection but persistence. Not avoiding mistakes but meeting them at the door and calling them by name. Theo leaned back, eyes half closed, and let his body relax into the familiar rhythm of a world trying in its small and imperfect ways to be better than it was yesterday. The trees above him swayed gently, casting patterns of light and shadow across his face, and the hum of the world lawns being watered. Birds' chattering footsteps on a sidewalk began to rise in quiet crescendo. And yet, despite all the sound, what he felt inside was stillness. He knew there would be another case, another name, another headline. The cycle didn't stop just because one town had gotten it right one time. But somewhere in a training room, a rookie officer would remember a story about a man who didn't raise his voice when a gun was pointed at him, and maybe, just maybe, he'd think twice before seeing fear where only stillness lived. That's how change happens, slowly, through memory, through choice, through the invisible hand of one life, brushing gently against another, asking nothing in return but understanding. He stood up at last, the creak in his knees reminding him that no man walks through the fire unchanged, but he had walked through it, and he was still here. As he stepped back inside the screen door, closing with a soft click behind him, he caught a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror. Older, yes, grayer than he used to be, but still upright, still steady, still watching the world with the eyes of a man who had seen it fail and still believed it could do better. And that in the end was his answer to everything. Not a speech, not revenge, just the quiet, unwavering commitment to remain, to witness, to teach, to stay. What happened to Theo Brooks is more than just one man's story. It's a reminder of how easily fear, bias, and unchecked authority can collide in the most ordinary places. A grocery store, a Saturday afternoon, a quiet man buying cereal. It shows us that dignity can be mistaken for defiance, and calmness can be misread as guilt when prejudice is left unchallenged. But it also shows us something deeper, that justice doesn't always come in loud moments. Sometimes it comes in the quiet decisions people make when no one is watching, to stay calm, to speak up, to do the right thing even when it's hard. For those of us who've lived long enough to know that the world doesn't change overnight, Theo's story is a call to keep believing in the small victories, to know that standing still with integrity can be more powerful than shouting, that teaching, listening, and leading by example still matter. Whether you've worn a badge, raised a family, or simply tried to live a decent life, you know the weight of being seen unfairly and the power of being seen clearly. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the kind of justice we all deserve, not just in courtrooms, but in everyday moments, please take a second to like, share, and subscribe. Let's keep these conversations alive, not just for us, but for the generations, learning what courage, dignity, and accountability truly look like. You've stayed with us this far, thank you. Let's keep walking forward together.